This is Hannibal here from thehannibaltv.com, and today I have a very special guest. I'm honored to be talking to the winner of Robert Bigelow's Best Evidence for the Survival of Human Consciousness After Death essay contest winner. He won $500,000 for this award. Jeffrey Mishlove is a licensed clinical psychologist. He's an accomplished radio and television interviewer, the author of an encyclopedia volume of consciousness studies. He's the past director of the Association for Humanistic Psychology and has served as the president of the Intuition Network. And he's done a lot more, which we'll get into. But first of all, congratulations on winning this historic essay contest that Robert Bigelow put together.
Thank you, Devin. It's a pleasure to be with you. My original TV show that was out on national public television in the US and as well as public television stations in Canada was originally called Thinking Aloud, and that ran from 1986 to 2002. So when I started the YouTube channel in 2015, I called it New Thinking Aloud for that reason.
I see. Now, why don't you tell us a little bit about your educational background?
Okay, I got a bachelor's degree in psychology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison in 1969, probably, I'm guessing, before you were born. And I have a master's degree in criminology from the University of California at Berkeley. I got that in 1973. I have a doctoral degree in parapsychology, and I believe I hold the only doctoral diploma in the world that actually says on it parapsychology, and that was from the University of California at Berkeley in 1980.
When did you first become interested in consciousness and the study of consciousness?
I would say it really began when I was an undergraduate at a school in Madison, Wisconsin. Those were the days when students were experimenting with marijuana and LSD, and meditation and yoga. And so I got into all of those things, and I began writing a senior honors thesis in Madison on the topic of the psychology of religious mysticism. At the time, I was skeptical. I thought I'd end up describing the various psychopathologies associated with people who think they see ghosts and the like. But as I began researching the area, I discovered the work of Abraham Maslow, a great psychologist who pointed out that the most successful people in our culture, people like Einstein and Eleanor Roosevelt, who he studied, had all reported mystical experiences that were central to their lives. And I began to see things in a different way after that.
You discuss LSD and marijuana, and you said that you may have been involved in some of that. I've heard that some people think that can open you up to a different way of thinking, particularly the LSD, that would almost allow you to kind of cross over to a different way of thinking or a different side of consciousness. What do you think about that?
Definitely. That's exactly what it does. It opens you up to an egoless state, which many people would say is being in touch with your true self. And I have to admit, I took LSD a lot when I was a young person, maybe over 100 times. And as far as I'm concerned, it was of great benefit to me. I think it's a very important drug. It used to be studied extensively, and now there's a new resurgence of research in that area. I think it's all very promising, and I have nothing negative to say about it for myself. I've always had positive experiences with it, and I think it was an important catalyst to opened me up for the studies that eventually became my life's work.
So could you give us an example of quote unquote trip on that may have given you some ideas as far as the afterlife and like what happens beyond this world?
Well, you know, all of the personal experiences that I have had about the afterlife were not involved with drugs. The LSD experience, I certainly had a sense of higher consciousness. Well, something does come to mind, Devin. On LSD, you can, if you're taking it with friends, which I would do, if you look at a person, if you stare at their face, very often the face changes and you see face after face after face after face. It's as if you're looking at all of their past lifetimes, sort of. So I had that sense on LSD. Although LSD is a very powerful drug, and that sense was important, but it wasn't even, you know, I wouldn't call it the main thing.
How long does a trip on LSD last usually?
Gee, it's been a long time since I've taken LSD, but my best guess from my recollection is it could be about 8 hours, and you really need to give yourself a day to recover from it afterwards. It's very good after you've had an 8-hour trip to spend the next day, you know, in quietly absorbing and digesting and meditating and just sort of reflecting on what you've been through rather than jumping right into your normal habits and workaday activities.
Now you mentioned ghosts. How much of studying have you done in the field of ghosts and the paranormal?
Well, of course, as a parapsychologist, and particularly in preparation for the Bigelow essay, Devin, I've studied the literature extensively. Have I ever seen a ghost? Not visually, not with my eyes, although I've certainly spoken to people who have had that experience. But what really did trigger me was a dream experience I had in 1972, in which my great uncle appeared to me in a dream. And it was so powerful that when I woke up from this dream, a dream that felt more real than real, I was crying tears of joy and simultaneously singing one of the most sacred songs of my religious tradition of Judaism. I wrote home right away. I said, "How's Uncle Harry? I had a dream about him." My great uncle, who was 50 years older than me. And my mother called me on the phone immediately when she got my letter and said, how did you know Uncle Harry just died? Virtually at the moment I was dreaming about him. So that got my attention big time. And at that time, I was studying criminology. I was a graduate student at Berkeley. I was volunteering at San Quentin Prison, conducting group therapy sessions with murderers and rapists. And that's when I decided I needed to switch. I love the study of human deviance, but I decided I needed to look at the positive side of human deviance rather than the negative, which for me meant mysticism, parapsychology, intuition, and creativity. And that's what ultimately led me to create an individual, interdisciplinary doctoral major at Berkeley in parapsychology.
Now, from your research, what do you think about ghosts? What would you believe that these things are?
It's complex. You could say it's a hallucination. That's what they used to be called. You could call it an apparition. You find that in the literature quite a bit. But the question really is, what is the source of it? Whether it's a purely psychological experience or if it's an experience that has a physical component, we do have evidence that living people can project images of themselves. It's called bilocation. There are cases on record where a living individual will have the experience of being in two places at once. And people in a distant location will say, yes, he knocked on my door. He came into my house. We had a long conversation. He even had a cup of coffee while he was here. So that's the equivalent of a ghost. But it seems to me if a living person can project themselves in that manner, so can a deceased person. So I'm inclined to think that there's a reality to all of these reports about ghosts, but there are many different kinds of reports. So it's when you start looking into the literature, it gets extraordinarily complex.
I was watching one of Robert Bigelow's interviews with George Knapp before this contest happened. It was, I believe, the interview where he was announcing the contest, and he was talking about doing his research into the paranormal and ghosts, and eventually they had to stop the research because there was some negative stuff happening with the people doing the research that was actually following them back to their personal lives. Have you heard much about the negative aspect of ghosts and the paranormal?
As a matter of fact, on the New Thinking Aloud channel, I recently, just last week, in fact, released a lengthy interview with Colin Kelleher, who was the deputy administrator of Bigelow's research programs. And they call this the hitchhiker effect. And it's not just ghosts, it's a range of paranormal phenomenon associated with UFO appearances and very bizarre occurrences. And people went to a location in Utah called the Skinwalker Ranch, where they were conducting research, including people from the Pentagon who were interested in did this have any military significance. And they found that when they went home to Washington, D.C. from the ranch in Utah, that poltergeist-like effects, bizarre occurrences of a wide variety, including creatures of different sorts, seemed to be following them, and objects flying around the room and things of this sort. They speculated that the phenomenon appears very much like an infectious disease, that there's a certain contagion and that it can spread just like a disease would spread. At least, not that it is a disease, it might be completely different, but it would follow the same mathematical models that are used to map the spread of infectious diseases.
So that's getting into some pretty serious stuff, I guess, where some people might laugh it off, but that seems like it could almost become like a tormenting type thing to people.
You've got a very strange social situation, which is, you say, some people are feeling tormented by it, and other people are going to laugh it off and say, oh, you're crazy, you're making it all up, it's a hallucination. And that's why, Devin, everybody I know in the field of parapsychology, when we give public presentations, people come up to us afterwards and say, can I tell you about my experience? And almost always they say, I've never told it to anybody before, because they're afraid of being labeled crazy. It's a very unfortunate situation in our culture, because the truth is these experiences are very widespread.
Yes, it seems like it. Now, Robert Bigelow, of course, if anyone knows what's going on with UFOs, it's him, with all the research he's done, with all of his resources. What's your opinion on what's going on with these various UFO appearances all over the place?
Well, you know, I spoke to Robert about this a week ago, and his viewpoint was that they're less intense now than they were, let's say, in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, when there were massive UFO sightings. It's as if the phenomenon seems to be diminishing a little bit. I would agree with you. He's extraordinarily knowledgeable and has probably done more research in this area, financed out of his own pocket, than the government has done, although he was also the recipient of government funding through one of his programs. They, I think, received nearly $20 million from the government to look into this. I can't say that we have a final answer at all as to what's going on. It's not even clear to me whether we're looking at one unified phenomenon that manifests in many multiple ways, or whether these are a whole range of diverse phenomena that just sort of occur at certain locations. It's hard to know how much of it is purely psychological, how much of it is paranormal, how much of it involves nuts and bolts equipment. And the reason is because even with all of the efforts that Bigelow has put into it, and other people as well in other organizations, it's still a drop in the bucket compared to what's needed.
From talking to him, is it something we should be concerned about, or is this just a phenomenon that's been around forever and will probably continue forever?
Good question. It probably has been around, at least aspects of it have been around for a long time. As Jacques Vallée, a great UFO researcher, has pointed out, you can find comparable examples in the fairy lore of practically every culture. So Native Americans have a huge amount of lore concerning this. It does not seem to be, for the most part, a phenomenon that is intentionally aimed at harming people. There seem to be very, very few examples like that. On the other hand, there are probably quite a few examples of people who get harmed, maybe because they're in the wrong place at the wrong time. So it's not as if it's a risk-free phenomena. And it also seems to be the case, and this is one of the most mysterious aspects of it, that these UFOs for decades have been interested in our nuclear weapons facilities and have actually, from time to time, disabled our weapons launching capabilities, as if they're trying to give us some sort of a message about that. So we don't know the extent of the threat at this point. One of the reasons that the government set up what was called the OSAP program that was run through the Bigelow organization is that they wanted to determine the extent of the threat, if it existed. And the program was closed prematurely. I don't know that they ever were able to make a final determination.
For those that aren't familiar with Mr. Robert Bigelow, could you share a little bit with the fans watching about who he is and what his research has been involved with? We've talked a little bit about it, but just about his background and the essay competition that you entered.
Oh, okay. Well, I can tell you that I've only known him recently, maybe in the last year, although I've known of him for decades. He's been one of the major funders of research in parapsychology and psychical research for a long time. His interest dates back at least to the 1990s, if not earlier. He earned a fortune. He's a self-made man. He started out in the real estate business, I understand, by buying a single duplex and eventually built it into the Budget Suites hotel chain, which operates properties in 3 states. I believe his real estate business is worth many hundreds of millions of dollars now. And since the mid-1990s, he's sponsored research programs into the paranormal, including the Skinwalker Ranch as well. He is, like me, I feel a real affinity with him because he's willing to look right in the eye of the most bizarre, difficult to understand cases. The kind of cases that even parapsychologists don't want to deal with because they seem so weird. And I think it's very important that we look at the strangest cases if we're going to understand the phenomenology involved. As far as I can tell, he seems like a very nice person. I think his intentions are positive. In all of my years of knowing about him, I haven't heard very much in the way of negativity, although I think in our culture there's a certain amount of suspicion directed at anybody who's extremely wealthy. People always say things like, you can't get rich by being honest. He has to be doing something wrong since he's gotten so wealthy. I don't subscribe to that point of view at all. But I do think that Mr. Bigelow, being a self-made man, calls his own shots. He relies on the best expertise that he can find. He's always had the very top people on the boards of directors of his organizations, but he likes to be the final decision maker. And I can't fault that. I think that's a necessary quality in an entrepreneur.
For his essay contest, there was several prizes. The top prize, of course, was 500,000, and I think there was at least two other prizes, one for around 200,000 and another one in the hundred thousands. How did you hear about this contest, and what made you enter it? And I understand you had to have certain qualifications just to be able to enter it. Someone like me just couldn't enter it without the research experience that you have, for example.
Okay, I'll go through the story as best I can, Devin. I learned about this roughly a year ago. I think it was in December of 2020. The announcement was made that they were going to sponsor an essay competition for the topic was the best evidence for the survival of human consciousness after permanent bodily death. And then they published a application form. People could apply, and they said the minimum qualification was you had to be working professionally in the field, or maybe not even professionally, just seriously in the field, exploring life after death for at least 5 years. And they would judge that by things you might have published, by organizations that you might have belonged to. And you had to fill out a lengthy application process. Initially, you're correct. They announced that there would be 3 prizes for 500,000, for 300,000, and for 150,000. Later, they expanded that. They said, we're going to add 14 more consolation prizes. Each one will get 50,000. And then they expanded it again and added another, I believe, 11 more honorable mention prizes, and they each got $20,000. So I believe in total he gave out $1.8 million in prizes.
Wow. So can you tell us about your award-winning essay? What were you explaining in the essay as far as your theories and your evidence?
Well, the application form for the essay was written in such a way that I interpreted it to mean that they wanted you to write it as if you're going in front of a court of law and you want to convince a judge and a jury that that human survival exists, life after death exists, that there is an afterlife. And they made a point of saying, that being the case, we regard, as any jury would, human testimony to be very important. Now, That's a very different approach than scientists normally take. The scientific method and the courtroom are very different places. And I think many of the people who entered the competition, and I might say, I understand 1,200 people applied to enter, and of those, maybe 240 were accepted. And of the 240, 204 actually turned in essays. And I think many of those people, well-written essays, were written as if they were writing for a scientific journal. A scientific journal is not particularly based on human testimony. In fact, a lot of scientists take the attitude as expressed by the great philosopher David Hume in the 18th century, who wrote that human testimony will never be sufficient to prove a miracle. So they just basically said the only good evidence is going to come from scientific studies. On the other hand, my career in parapsychology has been based largely on interviewing people, just like you do. And the reason for that is when you get a PhD in parapsychology, the only one in the world, who's going to hire you? Well, in England now, they have many people who did doctoral work in parapsychology. Their diplomas don't say parapsychology, but they are hired at universities all over England. Now, there are many dozens. But in the United States, I couldn't get much in the way of an academic position after I got my degree. I actually created a couple of academic programs, but I largely worked in the media, starting in 1972, right around the same time I began my doctoral research. So I had at my disposal nearly a half century worth of interviews that I'd done, and I was able to include in my essay actual video extracts that I could link to online of 18 different people talking about their firsthand experiences, having had near-death experiences or after-death communications, and another 18 scholars testifying about the validity of these experiences. So I included 70 different extracts of that sort as part of my essay. I think that's the reason why there were 6 judges and they unanimously voted my essay as the grand prize winner. Now, the other criterion that I paid a lot of attention to was that the essay should be intelligible to the average educated layperson, not necessarily to the other scientists who are specialists working in this field. And I think there were some brilliant essays written by people who are probably a lot smarter than I am, but they were written for a different audience. They didn't necessarily pay attention to the same instructions that caught my eye. And, you know, there were like a list of 9 or 10 instructions. So it's understandable that some people, especially people who have spent their whole lives working in universities, and there were some, would be thinking, well, I'll just write this the way I would write it for a scientific journal.
So you mentioned about the examples of near-death experiences that you cited in your essay. Could you talk about 1 or 2 of those near-death experience examples?
Sure. Probably the most famous near-death experiencer these days is Dr. Eben Alexander. He was a neurosurgeon working at Harvard University. When he went into a coma, he was unconscious for a week in the hospital. They thought he was gone, or they thought he would never recover. But he made a recovery, and he reported on what he experienced while he was in this week-long coma. It's very vivid. It's you know, in his words, it would be more real than real. It would be an experience of total love, greater than any kind of love you would experience here on Earth. It was an experience in which he felt he had contact with in his case, it was a sister that he had that he never knew in life because he was an adopted child. And nevertheless, his real parents had another daughter who died, and he had an encounter with that daughter while he was in his coma. He only learned about her afterwards. And when he saw her picture, he said, "Oh my gosh, that's the person I experienced during the coma." So that's very common. It's known as a peak in Darien experience. I'll explain that. I think your viewers will find it interesting. The peak in Darien refers to a mountain on the Isthmus of Panama. And in the 17th century, I believe, or 16th century, when the Spanish explorers first reached Panama, they climbed this isthmus, and they were surprised because they looked, and from the mountain peak, they could see the Pacific Ocean. They thought it was going to be a whole continent ahead of them, but there was an ocean they didn't even know existed. And so for people like deathbed experiencers, near-death experiencers who encounter a deceased loved one who they didn't know is deceased, or in Eben Alexander's case, didn't even know existed, the metaphor of peak and Darien is used.
How do you know that these aren't just hallucinations? I guess these various people have proved that they would have had no way of knowing that certain things happened during their near-death experiences. Had it just been a hallucination?
That's exactly right. I mean, it's hard to tell. Like if somebody is, let's say they're dying, and they're reporting deathbed visions, and they report, "Oh, there's my grandmother coming to greet me." Well, you could say, of course, she expects that that's what'll happen. That's what she's been raised to believe. So that doesn't have a lot of evidential value. But if they say, "Wait, there's cousin Susie, and she's there to greet me," and everybody thinks that cousin Susie is still alive in Memphis or wherever, but then you learn, oh no, cousin Susie actually died the day before. That becomes a little more evidential. But the most evidential aspect of the near-death experience is the fact that the brain is pretty much dead, inactive. For example, they've done studies of cardiac arrest patients in hospitals. Hundreds of people in hospitals will have a cardiac arrest. After about 30 seconds, there's no electrical activity in the brain at all. And yet these people are reporting vivid, intense experiences, which I might add, Devin, brings us back to the discussion about LSD and psychedelics, because researchers are now finding the same thing, that people are reporting the most amazing, vivid, intense experiences under psychedelic drugs, and yet the brain actually seems to shut down. And what that suggests is that the brain is not the generator of consciousness, but actually operates like a radio receiver, that it's receiving consciousness coming from somewhere else.
So when you mention people there to greet them after they pass, is this a common thing, or is there all different experiences that people have when they go dead for a period of time for whatever reason?
It actually is very common. It's reported in deathbed visions. It's reported in near-death experiences. And now there's another kind of experience that has been identified by Raymond Moody and others. Raymond is the person who launched the field of near-death experience back in 1975 with his book Life After Life. I'm pretty sure. Or is it life before life? No, that would be reincarnation. So the idea of the shared death experiences. If you're sitting at the deathbed, let's say your mother is dying, you're in the hospital at the deathbed as she dies, and she's now having an experience like a near-death experience, the early stages of the afterlife. Her soul is leaving her body. She's entering into a tunnel of light at the end. She sees her relatives coming to greet her. If you're a sensitive person at the deathbed, you may go with her in your own mind. You may experience what she's experiencing up to a point. And this has been reported by many people now. In addition, there's an experience called the meditation-induced near-death experience, where advanced Buddhist meditators who have had at least 10 years experience in meditating report that they can at will enter into this same experience, and they report experiences of communication with spiritual entities, etc., just almost identical, according to what is known as the near-death experience scale, or the Grayson scale, that reports the features of a near-death experience. So there are many ways that people can enter into this realm. And of course, it was known in ancient times, which is why we have the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Egyptian Book of the Dead and other accounts of the afterlife coming from meditative traditions in other cultures.
Now, as far as near-death experiences go, why would some people be reincarnated, for instance, and others go into the light or whatever to float around or do whatever it is they're going to do in the afterlife, and others maybe be stuck earthbound as ghosts? How would stuff like that be decided in your research?
Well, now you're relying, I think, for this report on a lot of widely known folklore, I'll call it, and or reports from people, because people have experiences and they get reported. So there's a lot of literature in this area, and the esoteric literature. I would say this, from a scientific point of view, we don't have answers yet. There hasn't been enough study, even though research has been investigated since the founding of the Society for Psychical Research in England in 1882. So we have over 140 years of research reports. It's done largely by volunteers. It's not a systematic research effort, a well-funded systematic research effort yet. And I can't say that we have answers to these questions, but if you look at the esoteric literature, which I think is pretty good, you might say that people have a choice, or you might say that it has to do with their karma or with their habits of mind. Some people never want to come back. I talk to people who say this earthly plane is terrible. I never want to come back. And other people say, I can't wait to come back and see what's going to happen next. So there may be an element of choice involved, or an element of habit. If you're in the habit of let's put it in colloquial terms, if your mind is always in the gutter, you may end up as one of these hungry ghost characters hanging around the earth plane, hoping to get a whiff of some sort of drug or alcohol or sexual experience. Whereas if you're a person who's oriented towards higher consciousness and spirituality, you might want to move into higher planes. I recently did a fascinating interview, Devin, a fellow named R.J. Spina, who cured himself of a diagnosis of permanent paraplegia and paralysis from the chest on down. And he had a lot of intuitive insights about it. And he said, most people, in order to gain all the lessons that we come into this earth plane to learn, most people need to spend 35,000 lifetimes in order to get that far.
In your research, does religion make a difference as far as the type of near-death experience someone might have?
It does seem that there's an important cultural distinction that can be made. People with a strong Christian background often report they meet Jesus on the other side. People with a Hindu background will report they meet Yama, the Lord of Death, or a Buddhist background will report Yama, who is, I think, also considered a Buddhist deity. People of the Islamic faith will report meeting figures that are known in their faith. So there does appear to be a lot of interaction between cultural expectations and what people report about their experience. Now, that could be a question of language. If you experience a radiant being in light, maybe the best way to describe that is to use the language you're familiar with. It may not mean that the actual experience is different from culture to culture.
What is your opinion on Ouija boards, how those things work, and who would actually be the ones contacting the people playing with it?
I have known people who have used Ouija boards and have come up with a lot of positive information that would be of scientific value. I have also known people who've gotten into real trouble. I'll give you an example of one of the most negative cases I've ever heard of. Some people were using the Ouija board and some spirit came through and it's told them, this was in the city of San Francisco, show up at a particular street corner tomorrow night at 4 a.m. Well, they didn't do it, but the next day or the day after, they read in the paper a murder took place at that location and at that time. So I think there's no doubt that you can have negative experiences with a Ouija board or with playing with, opening yourself up to the psychic level. And in popular terms, there's something called the lower astral plane, where hungry ghosts and negative spirits, demonic entities, and the like hang out. And there's always a risk for people when they open themselves up to these things that they'll get stuck there. Which can lead to very unfortunate consequences. I've had people open up to mystical experiences and say, I was told to marry this person, so I married them, and it was a horrible marriage. So there's a negative side to these things. I don't think it should be minimized, but I can say for myself, my experiences have always been positive, and maybe it's because, unique things about my own background. I did not have, as some people have had, a traumatic childhood, and very often people who have had trauma in their childhoods become psychic. And the reason for that is that it's a way for them to escape from the horrors of the physical world that they live in. But at the same time, they have to work through the emotional experience of the trauma, or they will draw to themselves when they enter the psychic world similar things. So I didn't have that. And maybe as a result, my experiences have been much more positive. But I'm well aware that you can have negative experiences dealing with anything related to psychic openings, whether it's drugs or a Ouija board or even meditation and yoga.
You mentioned about your essay, you put several examples of people that have had communication with entities from the other side. Could you give us some of those examples, that maybe some of the better ones from your essay?
Well, when I told you about my experience with Uncle Harry that came to me in a dream, the significant factor for me, Devin, is that it changed my life. I went from being a criminology student conducting group therapy sessions with murderers and rapists to becoming a parapsychologist. And so the cases that I reported on in my essay that I think were of the greatest interest were the cases where people's lives were transformed. I thought, you know, if you're going before a jury and you want to make a strong case for the afterlife, if you can say it's had a lifelong permanent effect on somebody, that's pretty good evidence, even though, you know, you don't hear about that too much in the scientific literature. So one of the cases I brought up is a famous case of Bishop James Pike in 1969, as I recall, or 67 maybe. He wrote a book called The Other Side. He was the Anglican bishop, or the Episcopalian bishop, as we say in the United States, of California. Very high position in the Episcopalian Church. It was head of a big cathedral in San Francisco, Grace Cathedral, the largest church in the city of San Francisco. And so he was a very famous person. And his son died very tragically. It was a suicide. And after his son died, he was in England at the time. He met with British Anglicans who were familiar with spiritualists in England, where there was a strong spiritualist tradition. He attended seances with a number of mediums who brought the son through, and he had lengthy conversations with his son. He had lengthy conversations as well with Paul Tillich, a famous theologian who had been the godfather of his son, had written an introduction to some of Bishop Pike's books, and it was a good friend who had died. He found this very evidential, and as a result of that, he resigned his position with the Episcopalian Church because he felt that his duties as bishop wouldn't allow him to explore two things. One was the spiritualism and the afterlife, and the other was the real authentic meaning of Christianity, which I think he felt the church didn't really have. There are many people who say that, you know, the Christian churches today are not teaching authentic Christianity at all, that the teachings of Jesus were much more Gnostic or mystical than the churches teach. So he resigned for that reason. And unfortunately, he went to Israel to research the origins of Christianity, and he died in the desert. It was a very famous case. Another famous case that I wrote about was the case of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who is well known. At one time, I think Time magazine rated her as one of the 100 most influential people of the 20th century. She's the one who came up with the stages of grief that people go through when they face death. And she was starting to research life after death. But her seminars, she was teaching seminars on the afterlife. They weren't going well. And she had decided she was going to get out of the field. She was going to leave it completely. This is before she became famous. And she was about to tell, she was at the University of Chicago, working with a minister, and she was about to tell him, I'm getting out of this after death and stages of grief business completely. My work is not being responded to. She was standing at the elevator, about to go to her office, when a woman appeared next to her and said, may I walk with you to your office? Just as she was about to tell this man, I'm quitting. And so they started walking to the office, and all of a sudden she recognized this woman is Mrs. Schwartz. Mrs. Schwartz is the woman who first told me about her near-death experience. Mrs. Schwartz introduced me to this study of the afterlife. But wait, Mrs. Schwartz died 10 months ago. And she realized she's walking next to a woman who had died 10 months ago, walking to her office. And when they get there, Mrs. Schwartz pleads with her. She says, please don't give up the work you're doing. You must continue. You must promise me you are going to continue. Make a promise to me right now. And Elizabeth Kubler-Ross looked at her, and she said it was a look of pure love. She penetrated my whole being. I understand what she meant, because that's the experience I had with my Uncle Harry. But she had the presence of mind. She said to Mrs. Schwartz, would you mind writing a note for me? And Mrs. Schwartz wrote a note and signed it with her name. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross promised. And then Mrs. Schwartz walked out the door of her office. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross was stunned, and she was amazed, and she looked out into the hallway to see her, but Mrs. Schwartz had disappeared. But that changed her life. She stayed in the field of life after death and the stages of grief, and as a result became one of the most famous people in the world.
Has your research made you less fearful of death? And also, when someone close passes to you, does it make you grieve less, knowing that there's another side? Or do you still have that natural fear of passing away in you?
Yes and yes. I think it has pretty much eliminated the fear of death. I pretty much figure I've probably lived and died thousands of times already. And I don't feel afraid of death, but I'll tell you, I'm not a totally liberated person. I'm not totally enlightened. I don't like pain. Now, you're a wrestler. You know something, and I'm sure your viewers understand a few things about pain that I don't understand. I do whatever I can to avoid pain. So I would not want to have a painful death, to be quite honest.
As far as the $500,000 prize money, is there anything that you have in mind in doing with that money?
Well, a lot of it is going to go into the New Thinking Aloud YouTube channel. I've been building this channel up for the last 7 years. You have a YouTube channel with 3 times as many subscribers, so congratulations for that. But I'm hoping to grow the New Thinking Aloud YouTube channel and use a lot of the money to make it a better channel. In different ways. I can probably learn a lot from you and from your audience.
If someone's going to look up your channel, New Thinking Aloud, is there any interviews that were extra special to you that you would suggest people look up on your channel?
Well, I've done over 1,000 interviews now are up on that channel. I mentioned the one that I released just last week with Colm Kelleher, who is Mr. Bigelow's deputy administrator and has been involved in paranormal research. It happens to be one of the most popular interviews. And if your viewers, and I'm just guessing that your viewers who are interested in professional wrestling would also be interested in the most bizarre examples of paranormal research, I think they would like that one very much.
What do you think about possessions? Is that a possibility in your opinion?
Yes, I wrote about possession in my essay. There's a fabulous case of possession out of India that I wrote about. It's called the Shiva Sumitra case. This is where a young woman named Sumitra is a mother. She has children. She's married. She gets sick and appears to die. They're getting ready to cremate her when all of a sudden she wakes up. But she says, I'm not Sumitra, my name is Shiva. And she goes into great detail about how she had been murdered some months earlier. And she has children, and she describes her life as Shiva. And but here she is, she's married to Sumitra's husband. She has Sumitra's children. She's in Sumitra's body. And eventually, the parents of the woman, Shiva Tripathi, who live in another village about 100 kilometers away, learn about this case. It gets reported in the news and gossip spreads, and they hear their deceased daughter, who they believe has been murdered, is now speaking in the body of another woman, and they come and visit, and she recognizes them and hugs them and greets them warmly and gives them information that only they could know. And her mother tries to hide and disguises herself, but Shiva identifies her right away. And it's very clear that as far as Shiva is concerned, she is not Sumitra. She has Shiva's memories. She doesn't have Sumitra's memories. And she remains in that body for the rest of her life, I think 13 more years. She has children with Sumitra's husband because now she's in that family. That's who, she continues in that family. But to her dying day, she insists and she makes people call her Shiva, that she never was Sumitra. So it's an excellent case. It's been researched extensively by parapsychologists, and it appears to be strong evidence of possession, not demonic possession, but possession by a person who had been deceased.
So the other person whose body it was previously just disappeared?
Yeah, you might say she died. It's hard to know for sure. Some researchers call it replacement reincarnation. That is, one person died, but the body is still warm, and another person enters it and revivifies it.
What would be the most frightening contact from the afterlife incident that you've been aware of?
Well, that's a good question. Let me think. The most frightening case that I am aware of. Well, all right. In the literature, there's a very famous case. It was even made into a movie in Brazil. There's a very famous medium in Brazil named Chico Chaviere. He died. He was considered the greatest medium in the world, probably in the 20th century. Very humble person. He worked as a menial clerk his entire life, but he wrote hundreds of books dictated by other spirits. They sold millions of copies, and he donated it all to charity. And he was so beloved in Brazil, they issued a postage stamp in his honor. And one of the books he wrote was called Nosso Lar, which in Portuguese means our city, as I recall. And it's about a city in the afterlife. And it's supposedly written by a doctor, a real doctor, but they use the pseudonym of Andre Luis, a very important doctor who dies and is reporting from the afterlife. And Andre Luis was apparently a selfish person. A very self-important person, and apparently even a famous medical researcher in Brazil. But when he dies, he's has a heart attack, and he describes spending 7 years in the afterlife in a very hellish environment, because I suppose you could say it was a reflection of his own greedy consciousness. It was a dark world. It was a world, it's portrayed very vividly in the movie No Solar, which it has been published with English subtitles. And he is just surrounded by horrible, evil people until, and this goes on for years, until finally he has had enough, and he begs and he prays for the first time, Jesus Christ, please help me. And people come and rescue him and take him to this city in the afterlife called No Solar. But it certainly suggests that if you're the kind of person that all you are thinking about is yourself, And if you're a selfish person, you may end up in a reality that of other selfish people just like you, and you won't like it. And that's one of the most frightening descriptions I have ever seen of the afterlife.
I understand you're a minister in training at the Center for Spiritual Living. Could you explain to us what this is exactly?
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because I'm not really a minister in training. I am an instructor of ministers in training. And I should also point out, just to correct something you said earlier, I am not currently a licensed clinical psychologist. I was when I lived in California. I left California in 2001. So since I wasn't in the state where I was licensed, I stopped practicing as a clinical psychotherapist then. So I'm a former psychotherapist. I left in good standing. But with regard to the Centers for Spiritual Living, I do teach there. I teach two courses, one on parapsychology and one on William James, a great psychologist, the founder of American psychology, who was also a deep researcher into life after death and parapsychology, or psychical research as it was known in his day. Let me say a little bit more about the Centers for Spiritual Living. It's formerly known as the United Church of Religious Science. They changed their name. And it was founded by a man named Ernest Holmes at the turn of the century. It's part of what is known today as the New Thought movement, which came out of the American Transcendentalist movement, of which William James was really part back in the end of the 19th century in New England.
You mentioned earlier about working with prisoners. Is there any prisoner that stands out to you that was a little bit disturbing to work with from a psychological standpoint?
Well, to be honest, they were all pretty disturbing and pretty disturbed people from a psychological standpoint. My experience in working at the prisons was that these people, no matter what they did, were human beings just like me. And probably, even though they committed horrible crimes, 90% or probably 99% of the time, they were living their life just like anyone else, and deserved to be treated with the respect that you would give any other human being. And I found that in the prison system, the guards and even the other psychotherapists there didn't share that attitude. They would describe the prisoners as these people are a different kind of cat, as if they're not really fully human. And that bothered me a great deal. I, for example, got to know one fellow who he was in prison because he shot a policeman. Well, he was having a heated argument with his wife, and he pulled a gun, and the wife called the police, and the police showed up, and he was in a crazy, highly distraught state, and he shot the policeman, and so he's spending the rest of his life in prison. But, for the most part, he seemed like a very gentle, loving man. And I'm under the impression that everybody, no matter who they are or what they've done, even people I tend to dislike enormously. And, when it comes to politics, I could tell you I dislike people in politics who disagree with me. But at the end of the day, I have to say we have to recognize our common humanity. It's so important in our culture. And it's a terrible shame that that is not always the case in our prison systems.
So just to sum up, as far as your research goes into your essay, there's no final conclusion on what exactly happens to you when you pass away, other than your consciousness survives and your body's pretty much just a vessel that you're inhabiting for a period of time. But what happens when you pass could be a variety of things.
Well, I think the best guides that we have for that would be a very interesting book, and it was dictated through automatic writing. Supposedly it came from Frederick Myers, who was a great psychical researcher at the turn of the century. He wrote the classic 2-volume book called Human Personality and Its Survival After Death. And Myers died in 1902, as I recall. After his death, he initiated many, many communications with other people he was one of the founders of the Society for Psychical Research. So if anybody was motivated to communicate from the other side, he was. And in the 1930s, he dictated 2 books through an automatic writer named Geraldine Cummins. She would be writing as fast as she could, unconsciously. She wasn't even aware of what was being written. And she was writing so fast with her eyes closed that she had a person with her who would change the sheet of paper under her pen as she was writing. And Myers dictated these 2 books that describe the afterlife in great detail. He describes it in a way that is consistent with a lot of other literature, having to do with stages through which the soul evolves. That he describes it in terms of 7 stages, which you find in a great deal of esoteric literature on that subject. He doesn't go into reincarnation particularly, but we have good data on reincarnation from the University of Virginia, where they've been studying it for the last 50 years. They have on record 2,500 cases of young children who report memories of past lives almost as soon as they can begin to talk. And of those, I think 1,700 cases are those in which they were actually able to identify the past life person, what they call the previous person, as identified by the children on the basis of what the children were able to say. So we have good evidence, that at least 1,700 people did reincarnate. And it may not be that everybody needs to or will. I think that's an open-ended question, but I do think that's another option for people, as is possession that we just described, or replacement reincarnation, as some would like to call it.
Where can my viewers follow you if they want to learn more about you? Obviously, your YouTube channel, but I assume you have other social media as well.
Well, if a YouTube channel is far and away the best place to start, they can go to newthinkingaloud.com. And that is one word, and New Thinking Aloud is ALLOWED rather than ALOUD or out loud. So if they go to newthinkingaloud.com, they'll get to the YouTube channel, and from there, if they dig deeper, they'll find links to, we have a weekly newsletter which goes out to our subscribers. It's free. You can subscribe for free. There's no charge, of course, for the videos, and we're putting up 4 videos every week.
Very good. Well, I actually subscribed about a week ago when I first started talking to you, and I'm going to keep following you, and hopefully maybe we could have you back on again someday. And congratulations again on winning the essay contest. And I really appreciate you coming on and talking to me. I'll let you close this off however you want, with whatever you want to tell the fans.
Well, let me say this, Devin. I want to congratulate you for reaching out to me, and especially coming from the world of professional wrestling as you do and as your fans do. That's a world with which I'm pretty unfamiliar, but it's very exciting to me to discover as a result of winning this essay, that people who have lives that are so different from mine, I've devoted my whole life to exploring the paranormal, but I'm fascinated to think that people from the world of wrestling, or I've discovered there's something in Japan they call drifting, which is an illegal form of street racing. And I got contacted by a fellow who has a huge website involved in drifting, which they do in Japan. And he's fascinated by this work in the afterlife. So it seems to me that as a result of the Bigelow essay, I'm getting to reach out to whole new communities of people, because at the end of the day, we all share something in common, which is we're all going to die, and we all have a certain measure of curiosity about what's that going to be like.
Thank you for watching the Hannibal TV. Please help me out and like this video, then click the subscribe and get notifications buttons so you don't miss any of my latest shoot interviews, match videos, or news updates. Follow us on Facebook at the Hannibal TV for more live streams and videos. And while you're at it, follow us on Instagram and Twitter at the Hannibal TV.